This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, another important nakuda to mention about Rashi, aside from his commentary on Chumash and the Gemara, as we mentioned on the bus, the family that Rashi established is really, in a way, the greatest accomplishment of Rashi. As we mentioned, Rashi and his two son-in-laws, Rabbeinu Yehuda Bar Nassan, Rabbeinu Meir, his grandchildren, the Rashbam, the Rivam, Rabbeinu Tam, the mother of the Rihazakin, fourth generation, fifth generation, Rabbeinu Elchanan, sixth generation, the Balei Atosis on Moed Katan, Rabbeinu Shmuel. It's a very important observation that all the books on the Chumash open up with a comment of Rashi about HaKadosh Baruch Hu's love for Klal Yisrael. Bereshis begins, B'Shvil Yisrael, Shenikru Reishis. Shemois begins, why is Hashem always counting us? And by Yigash, He counts us again in Shemois. Why? Lohidia Chibasan. Hashem should show us how much He loves us. Vayikra, that before Hashem speaks to Moshe, He always calls him first. Lashain Chiba, Rashi says. Bamidbar, Rashi says, why is Hashem always counting us? Kekoichavim, Lashon Chiba. And then Devarim, Rashi says, why is the criticism of the Jewish people V'derech Remez? Why is it not overt? Mibnei Kavoidon Shel Yisrael. Rashi always begins every book with the glory and the love for Klal Yisrael. In fact, if you remember, does anybody know what should be the way Bamidbar begins? What was the first story chronologically in Bamidbar? Pesach Sheni. So Rashi Maloischa says, why is this not first? Rashi says, out of order, because Hashem doesn't want to start the Sefer criticizing the Jewish people. It's even the Mefarshim Arbad, Rashi in the beginning of Bamidbar says, Bamidbar begins counting Klal Yisrael. That should be on the second pasuk in Bamidbar. Why does Rashi quote on the pasuk Vayedaber? Hashem is not counting us yet. It's because Rashi has to begin the Sefer with the Chiv of Klal, even though Ein Zeh Mekaymai. It's very interesting. They say Rashi was a big family man. In the Sefer Ha'ira, their tshuvas Rashi brought his grandchildren into the shul. I don't know if this would go over. Imagine if the Rav would come in with his kid on his shoulders, riding on his shoulders. Not sure how well that would go over. Yeah? Not on Simchas Torah. Stam on a Shabbos. Yeah? Rashi came in, he would come in with the child riding on his shoulders. We have a nusach that Rashi wrote tshuva to his son-in-law. You don't see tshuvas like this. Rashi ends off the tshuva in very endearing terms. Rashi writes that he sends his love to his son-in-laws, and he wishes his daughters and his grandchildren they should grow b'shalom, oid yenuven b'seva. You see the great avak that Rashi had to his grandchildren, and Rashi was mechadesh the following chiddush on the pasuk in V'aschanan, v'shinantam levanecha. You should teach your children. What does Rashi say? Elu hatalmidim. The chiddush of Rashi. Says Rashi, how do we know that talmidim have to be considered like children? Shenemar? Rashi says different than the Sifri. Shenemar? Banim atem lashem alekeichem. You're Hashem's children, which Rashi is interpreting that we're not actually Hashem's children, but we're Hashem's talmidim. The Kloisenberger Rebbe's Medayek, Rashi holds not like Rabbi Meir. Rashi holds like Rabbi Yehuda. That's the Kloisenberger Rebbe's diak. But Rashi says our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a relationship of Talmid as Talmidim. And Rashi continues, and just like a student has to be like a child, a Rebbe has to be like a father, Shenemar, Avi, Rechav Yisrael. So Rashi is who better than Rashi to define the role as of a Rebbe to be a father. And that is what Rashi is to Klal Yisrael. Rashi is Rabban Shel Yisrael, and Rashi is Avian Shel Yisrael. Now Rashi is always quoting Laz. He's always quoting Old French. Why is Rashi always busy with Old French? Rashi wants to give us French lessons. So the interesting Shem Shmuel says that a person's language affects their behavior. And the language of a certain country takes on the character of the country. And Rashi says the French were known to be the most lewd in Yonei Arayos. Now, based on what we learned on the first day, that the French are really Kenanim, and the Torah says, Kemasei Eretz Kenan Loisasu, that's the French are Kenanim. Kemasei Eretz Mitzrayim Loisasu. So therefore the French were the lowest Binyani Arayas. Rashi wanted to protect the Jewish people living in France, so he quoted Old French in order to inject Kedusha into Old French. Now, what was the original language that Rashi wrote in? Perish Rashi. What language he wrote? So what do you mean? He wrote in Lashon HaKodesh. That's what most say. The Ramah writes in a tshuva that Rashi did not write it in Lashon HaKodesh. It is not something which is accepted to be accurate, but that is what the Ramah writes in a tshuva, that Rashi did not write his Perush in Lashon HaKodesh. There's a tshuva from Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda Katzenolenbogen that vehemently disagrees with this. Now, what does Tosfos call Rashi? Perush, b'kuntris. Where did kuntris come from? Where did this expression kuntris come from? In Latin, the word kuntris means quantarino, a fifth, a quart. Rashi's Perush originally was written in, the way it was published, in five-sectioned booklets. 5 sections, kvart. So that's why it's called Perush b'kuntris. Okay, so now we're going to have a little bit of a test. We're going to go around, if you know, the 6 generations around. We're not moving from this globe until, okay, we're starting with Rashi. Next generation? Miriam and Yocheved. Very good. What about her? 3rd generation. We don't know if she ever existed or not. Okay. 3rd generation, Rashi's grandchildren. Who are they? Rashbam. Number 2. Who? Number 2. Rivam. Rabbeinu Yitzchak Bar Meir. Number 3. Rabbeinu Tam. Number 4. Rabbeinu Shlomo Abachar. And the sister. Okay? Any girl in the family of Rashi, you don't know her name? Miriam. Okay? No, really. That was a very common name. 4th generation, nephew of Rabbeinu Tam? The Ri Hazaken. Generation 5. Ri Hazaken's son? Rabbeinu Elchanan. And number 6? Rabbeinu Shmuel. Okay. Zechusam Yagen Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.